So Benedict Rogers is a human rights activist and a journalist. He's the co-founder and deputy chairman of the Conservative Party's Human Rights and Commission, and the founder of Hong Kong Watch. He is also a member of the advisory group of the Interparliamentary Alliance on China and an advisor for the World Uyghur Congress. We're very delighted and honored tonight to have Benedict Rogers with us to tell us a bit more about the Uyghur situation. Without further ado, I'd pass on to Ben.
Well, thank you very much. It's can you all hear me okay? Great. It's really a great privilege to be with you. I'm sorry that I can't actually be with you in person. None of us can be meeting in person, I guess, but it's great to be with you virtually and to have this chance to address this really important topic. I have to admit, I was surprised when I was told that I had up to 50 minutes to speak, and I had to double check that a couple of times. But I'm really grateful that you do provide such an allocation of time, because to me that's a sign that you recognise this is a significant issue of our times, and we have a chance both for me to go into it in some depth, and then hopefully plenty of time for questions and discussion afterwards. We are witnessing today in Western China one of the gravest human rights crises of our modern times. Increasingly, the evidence suggests, and a growing number of experts argue, that what is happening to the Uyghur people in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, or as they prefer it to be known, East Turkestan, amounts to genocide. Undoubtedly, mass atrocity crimes are being committed, and that's why the title for tonight, Never Again, All Over Again, is so appropriate. But before I start to unpack the specific situation of the Uyghurs, I think it's worth just putting it in context briefly. I think it's fair to say that the Chinese Communist Party regime under Xi Jinping has embarked over the last 8 years or so on the most severe crackdown on human rights since the Tiananmen massacre of 1989 throughout the country, and arguably the worst assault on specifically religious freedom across the board since the Cultural Revolution. And although the plight of the Uyghurs, which is rightly our focus tonight, is undoubtedly the most egregious part of this picture, let's not forget the repression in Tibet, which is intensifying, with reports just in recent weeks of forced labor, similar to what has been happening in Xinjiang to the Uyghurs. The persecution of Christians has increased in recent years. There's been a crackdown on lawyers, civil society, independent media, and all forms of dissent. Reports of forced organ harvesting from prisoners of conscience, including but not limited to the Uyghurs. And of course, the dismantling of Hong Kong's freedoms, autonomy, and the rule of law, and more recently, signs of increasing repression in Inner Mongolia. And on top of that, the regime's threats towards Taiwan have increased, and its aggression more widely has grown. And just to give you a very brief idea of my background as I approach this subject, I first went to China when I was 18 to teach English in my gap year before university in the coastal city of Qingdao, famous for the best beer in China. That wasn't why I went, but it was a nice discovery once I was there. And I lived there for 6 months. And I fell in love with China. And I want to say from the outset that I am not, and never have been, never will be, anti-China. I am a critic of the oppressive policies of the Chinese regime, but that's a very different thing. And indeed, my commitment to human rights in China is because I love China as a country, want it to flourish and prosper, and respect it as a culture and as a very rich and ancient civilization. So after my time in Qingdao, I went back several times as a student. I did a master's in China studies at SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. And I lived and worked then as a journalist in Hong Kong for the first 5 years after the handover of Hong Kong. And I've been in and around China for really the last 25 years or so, traveled regularly inside the country until 3 years ago I was denied entry to Hong Kong on the orders of Beijing, and I therefore, I think, safely assume that I can't go into the mainland anymore either. And as I've already been introduced in terms of my different roles, but in all of the affiliations that I have, I'm deeply involved in China, and even in work that I've done in other parts of Asia, particularly in regard to North Korea and Burma or Myanmar. I see the influence of the Chinese regime. So that's a bit of context and background to how I see the Uyghur situation. But let me turn now to the specific topic of tonight. What is happening to the Uyghurs, and what can we do about it? I think those are the two questions that I'd like to try to address. The regime's campaign against the Uyghurs is multifaceted, and of course it has been going on for decades. It's not a recent phenomenon, but it has intensified very significantly in recent years, to the point where now today there are estimated to be at least 1 million, and some people put it as high as 3 million, Uyghurs and other Muslim ethnic minority groups in that part of China, incarcerated in concentration camps, subjected to horrific torture, slavery, and sexual violence. A recent report by the human rights organization CSW, who I worked for many years and actually still do work for in a part-time capacity, a report called Repressed, Removed, and Re-educated: The Stranglehold on Religious Life in China Today, describes how Uyghurs have been detained for some of just the following reasons: having relatives who live abroad, accessing religious materials online, visiting other countries, engaging in communal religious activities, or sometimes they're given no reason at all. Inside the prison camps, conditions are dangerously unsanitary and overcrowded, and prisoners are subjected to severe beatings, sleep deprivation, forced medication, and solitary confinement. At a hearing of the US Congressional Executive Commission on China on the 28th of November 2018, Miradil Tursan described her experience in a camp, and her account is horrifying, but I think it's worth sharing as follows. She said, "I was taken to a cell which was built underground with no windows. There were around 60 people kept in a 430 square feet cell. We had 7 days to memorize the rules of the concentration camp and 14 days to memorize all the lines in a book that hails the communist ideology. They forced us to take some unknown pills and drink some kind of white liquid. The pill caused us to lose consciousness. I clearly remember the torture. I was taken to a special room with an electric chair. There were belts and whips hanging on the wall. I was placed in a high chair that clicked to lock my arms and legs in place and tightened when they pressed a button. My head was shaved. The authorities put a helmet-like thing on my head. And each time I was electrocuted, my whole body would shake violently, and I could feel the pain in my veins. I thought I would rather die than go through this torture, and I begged them to kill me." Religious freedom is suffocated, is denied, with mosques and shrines of religious, cultural, and historical importance destroyed, religious sites transformed into tourist spots, with Uyghurs compelled to perform their culture for tourists, and Uyghurs who display any form of religious activity, prayer, reading the Quran, fasting, abstaining from pork or alcohol, wearing a headscarf, or having a beard of a particular length, risk jail for those acts. As a recent report written by the academic Adrian Zentz reveals, the regime is conducting a campaign of forced sterilization of Uyghur women, targeting 80% of Uyghur women of childbearing age in the 4 Uyghur populated areas of Xinjiang, which, according to the 1948 Genocide Convention, could elevate this to the level of genocide. Recently, a brave Uyghur doctor told ITV, I don't know if any of you saw this, but that she had personally conducted at least between 500 and 600 operations on Uyghur women, including forced contraception, forced sterilization, and forced removal of wombs. And then there's slave labor. Uyghurs are being transferred to other parts of China for slave labor and are working in factories that are manufacturing for high street brands. And I'll come back to that point a little later, and also with some thoughts on what we can do in response to that. But let me come back to this question of genocide now at the heart of this. In July this year, in a letter to the Chinese ambassador in London, the president of the Board of Deputies of British Jews, Marie van der Zyl, said that nobody could see the evidence and fail to note what she describes as, and I quote, similarities between what is alleged to be happening in the People's Republic of China today and what happened in Nazi Germany 75 years ago. People being forcibly loaded onto trains, beards of religious men being trimmed, women being sterilized, and the grim spectre of concentration camps. Before her letter, there was a decision by the Jewish News to highlight the discovery of 13 metric tons of Uyghur hair, which they described as an act with Nazi resonance. And they highlighted this on the front of the newspaper. This was a shipment to the United States. This was also followed by a Twitter message by the former Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who wrote these words: as a Jew, knowing our history, the sight of people being shaven-headed, lined up, boarded onto trains, and sent to concentration camps is particularly harrowing. That people in the 21st century are being murdered, terrorized, victimized, intimidated, and robbed of their liberties because of the way they worship is a moral outrage, a political scandal, and a desecration of faith itself. These comments I begin with because I think they're extremely significant because, as many of you, if not all of you, will know, comparisons with the Holocaust are extremely rare. And for the Jewish community in particular to be making this comparison with what is generally regarded as a unique horror in history illustrates very powerfully the severity of the situation. But there are other sources of evidence that should be referred to as well. Leaked high-level Chinese government documents revealed last year speak of, quote, absolutely no mercy. These were documents that were 400 pages or more that were revealed by the New York Times and other media, high-level government documents. And China's own state media has declared that the aim in this crackdown on the Uyghurs is, quote, to break their lineage, break their roots, break their connections, and break their origins. As the Washington Post put it in an editorial, it's hard to read that as anything other than a declaration of genocidal intent. Professor Adrian Zentz, who I mentioned earlier, describes the situation as the largest detention of an ethno-religious minority since the Second World War. And a Newcastle University academic, Joanne Smith-Finley, has described what she calls, quote, a slow, painful, creeping genocide. The United Nations Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination has described the region as, quote, a massive internment camp shrouded in secrecy, a no-rights zone, while members of the Xinjiang Uyghur minority, along with others who are Muslim minorities, are being treated as enemies of the state based on nothing more than their ethno-religious identity. Some of you may have seen in July this year the episode of Andrew Marr's program on Sunday morning, where he had the Chinese ambassador in the studio, and he presented him with drone footage of people being loaded onto trains and taken to other parts of China as slave labor. And he then had the Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, following on from that. And the Foreign Secretary acknowledged that, quote, gross, egregious human rights abuses are going on, which are reminiscent of something we have not seen for a very long time. He stopped short of calling it genocide, emphasizing that one has to be very careful about the term, but he left the door open for efforts to move towards that determination. And he's right. The term genocide has a specific legal definition, and it should never be used lightly at all. But being careful about it does not mean being inactive. Calls on the international community to determine what legal term should apply to the litany of crimes against the Uyghurs have so far failed to receive a response. In June this year, over 50 United Nations special rapporteurs called on the UN to establish an investigative mechanism into human rights in China, and particularly the Uyghur situation. So far, that has not materialized. The Bar Human Rights Committee of England and Wales has published a paper setting out steps that the international community could take, both to investigate and to act following an investigation. And 76 faith leaders from all major religions, including the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, have called for an investigation and accountability. It's not every day that a former Archbishop of Canterbury, 7 Anglican bishops, 2 Asian Catholic cardinals, a Coptic Orthodox Archbishop, 20 Jewish rabbis, more than 20 Muslim clerics, the Dalai Lama's representative, the Chief Executive of Humanists UK, a leading American Southern Baptist, and Jonathan Aitken come together. But this is an issue that they all came together on, 76 of them, and to highlight this potential genocide. As they say in a letter that they issued in August, the suffering of the Uyghurs amounts to one of the most egregious human tragedies since the Holocaust. They say, we've seen many persecutions and mass atrocities, which all need our attention. But there is one that, if it is allowed to continue with impunity, calls into question most seriously the willingness of the international community to defend universal human rights for everyone, and that is the plight of the Uyghurs. Because if the international community isn't prepared to stand together and take action despite the power and influence of China, then in a sense, when is it prepared to act? After the Holocaust, the world said never again, and today we repeat those words never again all over again, those 76 faith leaders declared. They said, we make a simple call for justice, to investigate these crimes, to hold those responsible to account, and to establish a path towards the restoration of human dignity. Just around the same time as that, and I'm sharing these things to illustrate there's a real sense of momentum behind this issue. This is an issue that's been going on for many years, and particularly intensely in the last 4 or 5 years. But it's really been this year that suddenly the world seems to have woken up and there is momentum. Majid Nawaz, a prominent activist, a Muslim, went on hunger strike for the Uyghurs and promoted a petition for a parliamentary debate regarding the imposition of Magnitsky-style targeted sanctions on the Chinese regime for its treatment of the Uyghurs. And that effort succeeded, and actually just earlier this week, that debate took place in the House of Commons and was a very powerful debate. The Bishop of Rochester called in the House of Lords for sanctions in response to gross human rights abuses in China. The head of the Asian Bishops' Conference of the Catholic Church, the Cardinal of Burma or Myanmar, Cardinal Bo, said that the Uyghur Muslims are facing what amounts to some of the contemporary world's worst mass atrocities, and he called on the world to investigate. Sadly, one of the tragedies of this situation, and you may want to ask me about this during the Q&A, is that two of the world's most significant religious leaders, the Pope and the current Archbishop of Canterbury, are yet to speak out. And I have some reflections on why that may be, which we could come back to if you want to. But let me turn now to, I've cited many sources saying how serious this is. Let's look at what can be done in response. One of the things that is now underway, despite rather than because of government, it's underway because governments and the United Nations haven't acted yet. But there is underway a new tribunal called the Uighur Tribunal, which has been established to address specifically the question of genocide, to ask and answer the question, is this genocide? And that tribunal is chaired by a British barrister called Sir Geoffrey Nice, QC, who was the man who prosecuted the former Serbian dictator Slobodan Milosevic in The Hague 20 years ago for the genocide in Srebrenica and other crimes in the former Yugoslavia. He's been an expert on international human rights law for all those years. He's advised on similar situations such as the Rohingya genocide in Burma and Myanmar. He's been very supportive of initiatives such as the UN Commission of Inquiry on Crimes Against Humanity in North Korea. And last year he chaired an independent tribunal to investigate allegations of forced organ harvesting from prisoners of conscience in China. And so he is now leading this new inquiry to look at the question of genocide with regard to the Uyghurs. The model of the inquiry that he's leading is in the tradition of independent people's tribunals, which actually began as a concept when Bertrand Russell initiated an inquiry in 1966, together with the French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, into America's actions in the Vietnam War. And it's a People's Tribunal is basically an independent body. It has no official status or enforcement mechanism, but it's an initiative really for civil society to say if governments and multilateral institutions like the UN refuse to act unless it's convenient for them, then civil society can act to establish the truth. And so the tribunal is made up of a body of experts, of eminent people. Its credibility comes from the experience and reputation and authority of the individuals on the panel, and it has, in a sense, both a moral authority and a authority that comes from their expertise. But as I say, no enforcement mechanism. But that has now been set up for the Uyghurs, and it'll probably take the best part of a year or more before while they hold their hearings and inquiries and deliberate and come out with their judgment. But what could be done in the meantime? Well, I mentioned the call from the 50 UN special rapporteurs for a specific mechanism on China. That's one thing that we should push for. I've hinted at Magnitsky sanctions, which the legislation is now in place in the British Parliament, and that could be used to impose not sanctions against the people of China, but targeted sanctions against officials in the Chinese regime who are directly responsible for these crimes. But there are other areas where we, as citizens, can also respond to this crisis. I don't know how many of you are aware of the new Disney film Mulan that has been released. I think it's only released online, not in cinemas, because well, I guess not many people are going to cinemas in this pandemic. But anyway, it's been released, and shockingly, that film was made with direct collusion by Disney with the authorities, not just in China, but actually in Xinjiang. The film was filmed in the very region which houses these prison camps that I've described. And so I believe that we should have a consumer boycott of Mulan. The film ends, the credits to the film, and I haven't seen the film itself, but I know the credits actually give a special acknowledgement to the authorities in Xinjiang for their cooperation and assistance in the film. And so there is a Boycott Mulan campaign. It's out there on social media, and I would encourage you not to see Mulan and to encourage your friends to join this boycott. There's the question of the Beijing Winter Olympics, which are due to be held in 2022. And I would ask, how can a regime that is charged with such a litany of human rights crimes deserve to host the 2022 Winter Olympics? Shouldn't we be urging the International Olympic Committee to strip Beijing of its right to host the Games, to move the Games to another location? And if that can't be done, and there may be reasons why it's not practical, but if it can't be done, then at least there should be a ban by democratic countries on official attendance at the Games. We shouldn't have government ministers or members of the royal family, for example, going to the Games. And I would encourage a consumer boycott too, and efforts to pressure the sponsors. I wouldn't put pressure on the athletes themselves, because I think it has to be an individual choice according to the conscience of athletes. And I understand that the Games are very important for athletes. So I haven't called for athletes to boycott it, but I think ideally the location should be moved. And if that can't happen, we should have the other measures that I've mentioned. Let me just come back now to what I alluded to right at the very beginning, and that's the issue of forced labor. And this relates to the cotton trade and the link to our high street brands. I didn't know this until fairly recently, until I got really more deeply involved in the issue, but more than 80% of China's cotton is grown in the Uighur region, and that accounts for almost 20% of global production, according to the Coalition to End Forced Labor in the Uighur region, which is a group of over 50 human rights organizations, including Anti-Slavery International and Human Rights Watch, and it's endorsed by another 280 other groups from more than 35 countries. But actually the picture seems even more extensive than that, because according to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the role of the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region in supply chains is, and I quote, much more prominent, because the Xinjiang region produces a number of commodities and products that are then incorporated into finished products elsewhere in China. And it claims that Xinjiang produces, as I just said, more than 20% of the world's cotton, and is the third largest producer of cashmere in China. And China is the world's largest cashmere producer. And that means, in effect, and this has been well documented by a number of research organizations, that major apparel products that are, including those sold by high street brands, Abercrombie and Finch, Adidas, Calvin Klein, Gap, Marks and Spencer, Nike, Polo, Ralph Lauren, Tommy Hilfiger, Victoria's Secret, and Zara are very likely selling products that are the direct result of slave labor. As Omar Canet, the director of the Uyghur Human Rights Project, has said, given that so much cotton is sourced from the Uyghur region, the fashion industry is uniquely culpable for forced labor, and by extension, systematic policies meant to destroy the Uyghur identity. Brands like the ones I've just mentioned, Canet says, are not only enabling Uyghur forced labor, they're also supporting an entire system of genocidal repression. Who is picking the cotton and stitching the clothes that Western consumers are wearing every day? Uyghurs, and drawn directly from the mass internment camps. I don't know, some of you may have seen on the BBC a few months ago an extraordinary video that came out of a man called Merdan Gapa, who used to model for the Chinese online retailer Taobao. And today, Merdan Gapa, who's a Uyghur, is handcuffed to a metal bed frame in detention in Xinjiang. But remarkably, he somehow was able to get access to a phone to film himself, to get that film out. And I would say to those involved in the fashion industry, to models who walk the catwalks just as he used to do, that they would do well to remember Merdan Gappa. At the very least, they should watch that video and use their influence in the fashion industry to speak out. They should be aware that there is a significant likelihood that the products they themselves are modeling have been produced by slave labor by Uyghurs. We should think of people like Dilnur Idris, a qualified Uyghur nurse who worked for years at a hospital attached to Xinjiang Medical University, who in February 2017 was arrested along with her husband, sent to the prison camps, and just 3 months later, she was sent to work in a textile factory. In June last year, she managed at grave risk to get a message out to her sister, who was in Australia, and that message read, "Please help me. If I can't get out of this place, you can tell the international community, whatever you can do." Of course, Uyghur slave labor is not confined to the textile or the fashion industry. A report by the Australian Strategic Policy Institute titled Uyghurs for Sale estimates that 80,000 Uyghurs have been transferred from Xinjiang to other parts of China to work in factories that are in the supply chains of at least 83 global brands in the technology, automotive, and clothing sectors. And recently, the United States took the unprecedented step of banning exports from 5 entities specifically in Xinjiang and Anhui provinces in China. It's very unusual to ban products from a specific region of a country, but the ban includes garments, cotton, computer parts, and hair products. And a US official said, these extraordinary human rights violations demand an extraordinary response. This is modern day slavery. At the New York Fashion Week recently, campaigners staged a protest on all these issues. And a similar demonstration took place at the London Fashion Week a week later. Sarah Ziff, the head of the Model Alliance, called on designers to speak out, saying the fashion industry profits directly from Uyghur forced labor. We can no longer deny the reality of genocide in fashion's global supply chain. Are you profiting off the oppression of a whole people? CSW, the organization I mentioned earlier, who produced this report earlier this year, Repressed, Removed, and Re-educated, has now launched a new campaign, which is titled, "Sorry, China, I'm not buying it." Because I think we as consumers should ask ourselves the question, do we want to buy goods that are made by slave labor? A Kazakh woman called Zira Ulkan, because the Kazakhs are also suffering in all of this alongside the Uyghurs, she was formerly detained in an internment camp and then subjected to forced labor in a factory. And she said the clothes factory was no different from the re-education camp. There were police, cameras, you couldn't go anywhere. There are also credible reports that in some cases factories are in the same compounds as the camps. So that's the issue of forced labor, and a coalition of over 180 NGOs are now calling on brands and retailers to take responsibility for this issue. We're not at this stage, unlike with the Beijing Olympics and Mulan, necessarily advocating a total boycott, partly because given the extent of the brand names that I've listed, that would be probably not a very practical thing to do. But also we want to give the multinationals a chance to take on board these points and respond before there's any kind of further boycott. And so we're urging these brand names to sign a commitment, to sign a brand commitment drawn up by the Coalition to End Uyghur Forced Labour, which will make corporations accountable for cutting ties with suppliers that are implicated in forced labour and ending all sourcing from the Uyghur region, from cotton to finished garments, within 12 months. Corporations withdrawing from the Uyghur region sends a very clear message to the Chinese regime that continuing to violate human rights will have a cost. And the cost the cost of fashion for ethnic and religious minorities is too high for retailers to turn a blind eye to, and nor should we. So I hope that these may be steps that you might consider joining in. And we are seeing some results from this. H&M has already led the way by saying that they will review their supply chains and withdraw from using Uyghur-produced products, and so I hope that others will do the same. As I draw towards a conclusion, because I'd like to leave plenty of time for questions, history is never kind to appeasers of tyranny, though I believe that it does reward those who stand up for freedom. And as I said earlier, there is a growing momentum now on this issue. There was recently at the United Nations a statement, I think signed by 39 countries, and the UK, I'm pleased to say, played a leading role in that. And that was a significant increase from previous statements in terms of the numbers of countries signing on to it. So there is not only in this country, but around the world, momentum. Earlier this week in the House of Lords, Lord Alton introduced or supported, helped to introduce an amendment to the trade bill that would prohibit trade deals with regimes that are proven to be committing genocide, and at the same time would require our courts to determine, based on evidence, whether or not genocide is occurring. And he highlighted the reason for this amendment, and there's a good chance that it may go through in the House of Lords and the support for it in the House of Commons. He highlighted the need for this by saying that as a signatory to the Genocide Convention, we're required to prevent genocide, to protect those affected by genocide, and to punish those responsible. But if no judicial authority declares a genocide to be underway, then we're not under any obligation to act, and hence there's a vicious circle. And he says very powerfully, the practical effect of this is illustrated by the Armenian genocide of 1914 to 1923. It is still unrecognized as a genocide. It involved the systematic mass murder and expulsion of 1.5 million ethnic Armenians. And yet, remember Hitler's infamous remark as he prepared the so-called final solution, when he said, "Who now remembers the Armenians?" The Labour MP Siobhan McDonough, also speaking in Parliament this week, said very powerfully, "If we look on, history will condemn our unforgivable cowardice and ask why those in power did not act." Lord Alton concluded his remarks, "Increasingly we might ask, who now remembers the Tibetans, in the same way that Hitler said, who remembers the Armenians? Who now remembers the Tibetans? And in the future, will other perpetrators of genocide one day ask, who now remembers the Uyghurs?" As one of the signatories to the faith leaders letter that I mentioned, Imam Mamadou Bokoum says, "We say never again, yet we never learn from the past. We had Srebrenica, Rwanda, Cambodia, and now we see signs of genocide and cultural wipeout in China against the Uyghurs. We must stand up for this ancient culture and people now and stop China's mass persecution of them." Failure to call the Chinese regime to account won't simply weigh on our consciences. It may well imperil our own liberties, because as that regime becomes ever more aggressive and expansionist abroad, just as it becomes more repressive at home, it becomes a greater concern for us all. So let us act now to ensure that not only are the Uyghurs remembered, but that their elimination is prevented. Let it not be never again, all over again. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ben, for that informative and harrowing account. Really, it's a bit difficult to show applause on Zoom, but people, there is an applause emoji down there if people want to show their appreciation. In a moment or two, I'm going to open it up to questions, and I want to remind people that you can still submit your questions on the app. We've had lots of questions coming in, and I'm going to put a link to where you can submit the questions in the chat in a moment. But before we go to questions, we have my colleague Ben Sewell is going to introduce a very important guest.
Hello there. Yeah, I'm Ben, as he said. And just before we go into questions, we would very much like to introduce our friend Mirehmet, who is here with us today. As a bit of background, Mirehmet is from the city of Kashgar in the Xinjiang region, but now works as a Uighur translator in Amsterdam. In 2017, him and his family were rocked by the news that his brother had been arrested in Kashgar by the CCP for the same reason that so many other Uighur people have been. So without further ado, I'd like to give the floor over to Mirehmet to tell us about his story and his campaign to find out what's happened to his brother. I think your microphone's still off.
Yeah. Thank you, Ben and Izzy, everyone, for arranging this, organizing this event. And thanks a lot for Benedict explaining the current situation of Uyghurs so well. I'm surprised, to be honest. A non-Uyghur person knows so much about the current situation of Uyghurs. There are very few. That's why I am a little bit surprised. If I as Ben says, I came to Holland. I work in Holland as translator, Dutch Uyghur translator. I came to Holland in 2004. Since 2004, I have never done anything anti-China because my family is still there. And if you do anything against China, or say anything against China publicly, then your family will be in danger back home. That's why I've been really careful. And my parents my father was really well educated man. He was a school director for more than 30 years of Uighur school in Kashgar, and then my mom has worked in the hospital, and later on as a doctor, and then later on she was promoted as a hospital director for more than 30 years. That means their status is quite high in Kashgar region. They know a lot of people they know a lot of people. Most of the people in Kashgar, they know them. So our family is kind of lucky family comparing to other Uyghurs. We had a chance to go to school, go to university, and that's why and then as long as if I don't do anything anti-China, then my family will be safe. That's what I thought until 2017. And in 2017, in May, June, July, my brother in Canada, I have another brother in Canada. He at that time he still had the Chinese nationality. He was called by my mom to come back home. He was clearly under threat of the Chinese police. At that time, around that time, a lot of Uyghurs abroad with Chinese nationality were asked to come back to China by their relatives and sometimes by the police. And they were threatened. And some of them went back, ended up in jail or in the camps. which turned out to be concentration camps where people get tortured, raped. That's why my brother in Canada didn't go back. He tried to convince the Chinese police in Kashgar that we are not anti-China. He's not doing anything against China in Canada, and he has good relationship with other ethnic Chinese in Canada. So he took pictures with his Chinese classmates and sent the pictures to, and then got proof from his school. Tried to prove that he has got nothing to do with politics, but it didn't work. And we were shocked before. If you are innocent, if you are not an Uyghur, as long as if they don't do anything political, there is always a way. There is usually a way of negotiating, especially with a family status like mine, like my parents. They've been good workers for the Chinese government for so many years. So but in 2017, it didn't work at all. As long as if you are an Uyghur, as long as if you are Kazakh, if you are not a native, if you are not an ethnic Chinese, Han Chinese in this case, then you are the enemy of. You are seen as a hostile group of China. So so those documents my brother in Canada sent home didn't work, and in August, another brother who was living in Kashgar, looking after my parents, and he was arrested. And my brother in Kashgar, he has never been political as well. Our family, we are not even religious. We have never had a Quran at home. I have never read the Quran in my life, and I have been to mosques, but not to pray. Just when I was a child, just to play. I don't believe in the religion, and in our family we are not raised religious at all. We have never discussed the religion at home at all, because our parents, they know it's not safe for us to talk about religion, to believe in religion. So and then my brother, who was working at the telecom office, he was arrested. He has 2 kids. He has his own family. And then, that was really shocking for us. We haven't expected that. And for me also, at that point, then I said, okay, the Chinese government is not going to mercy anyone, as long as if they are Uyghurs, or as long as if they are anti-China. Since then, I've been, my brother in Canada and me, we kept our silence. We thought like maybe my parents can find someone in a police, try to bribe or try to convince them to free my brother in Kashgar, and it didn't. And then we were also afraid if we speak up, then my brother, then it can put my parents in dangerous position. That's the reason we didn't speak up until July this year, June this year. And then I thought like, okay, and then I decided to make it public, the arrest of my brother. And I realized it's the only way to keep him alive, at least, even if we cannot get him released soon, but at least get some attention for him. Let the Chinese government know that we are looking for him. We are watching Chinese government. So this is the only way to keep him alive, at least, because according to the witnesses who came out of the concentration camps, as Benedict says, he gave very good examples of some witnesses. The procedure is first they get tortured, and according to some witnesses, the male and the female detainees, from 15 to 45 years old, they are raped. There's a big chance that they are raped. And also we hear a lot of news that the families of Uyghurs who were freed, they died after a couple of days after releasement. And we also hear a lot of news. People just died in the camps and in prisons. The witnesses are also describing how horrific the situation in the camps are. In the camps is. That's why that makes me really worry. I still don't know how my brother is at the moment, how he is doing, where he is, but he probably still alive. He's probably still alive, and yeah, that's what I'm doing is at the moment. I asked help from Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the Netherlands. They contacted Chinese embassy. They are communicating with each other about my brother. And I also applied for the working group of Human Rights Council, UN Human Rights Council. I got a reply from them at that time. They were going to discuss my brother's case in September session this year. So they already talked about it. But until now, there is no news about my brother yet. Oh, I heard the news that Chinese government has been silent. They didn't reply about my brother's whereabouts to UN. They have been silent. My brother in Canada, he is also trying to seek help from Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Canada. What is frustrating for me as an Uyghur is the General Secretary of UN, Antonio, his name is, I think. Yeah, he hasn't. I have never seen him criticizing Chinese this atrocity toward Uyghurs. Like, he hasn't criticized the Uyghur genocide. He hasn't even mentioned it. And also, yeah, Germany is a kind of a European Union leader. If Angela Merkel says something, that's quite heavy, that weighs in. But she has also been quiet. They are saying like China should improve human rights records, but for Uyghurs it is rubbish. It's not enough. They have to say, they have to mention, they have to say it like about the genocide. They have to stop the Uyghur genocide. It is a genocide. There are more than 10 million Uyghurs. Not all 10 million Uyghurs have to die to call it a genocide. It is a genocide because we are being killed. Uyghurs are being killed for being Uyghurs, or Kazakhs are being killed for being Kazakhs. So the Angela Merkel is not really saying, I haven't seen her saying anything mentioning this issue, addressing this atrocity, this genocide of this century, this century. So it is quite frustrating, and every time when I look at the world leaders speaking about human rights, then I say, oh, shut up, you are talking rubbish. Every time when say, oh, rule of law in Europe, no, it is still rubbish. There is no, if there is a rule of law, if there is a value, if there is a rule of law, you sign a lot of conventions of UN to stop the genocide. What are you doing then? You are doing nothing. And if you are, if you have the value for human rights, then why don't you criticize Xi Jinping? Why don't you criticize the Uyghur genocide directly? No. At the end of the day, the business is ruling the world. I am convinced, because for example, in Germany, the Angela Merkel hasn't said anything. This genocide has been since 2007. The last genocide Chinese is committing against Uyghurs is happening since 2017. Forget the before that, but the last genocide was started in 2017. It has been now more than 3 years. But the world leaders are quiet on it, and the Angela Merkel has been quiet. And recently, I read on the news, Volkswagen is going to invest about 16 or 17 billion euros or dollars in the car market or car production in China. That then I assume Angela Merkel has kept quiet because they are eyeing the Chinese still eyeing on the Chinese market. They're expecting something from the Chinese market. China will never allow Europeans of the free democratic country to have a free market in China. Not for nothing. Yeah, she is kind of in Uyghur we have a saying. She's drinking the soup of a goose who is still flying in the sky. So she is dreaming, and yeah, and still expecting something from China, but it's not going to happen. Sorry, I've talked too much, I think. Yeah.
That's perfect, Mirehmet. Can I just quickly ask you, are you comfortable with people asking you questions as well?
Sure, yeah.
Okay, so if you do have a question specifically for Mirehmet, just indicate it, so I know that one's for Mirehmet. Okay, so we're now gonna start with questions. The first question I have here is from Juno. Juno, I know you've submitted several questions, but if you can just ask one for now, if you can please unmute yourself and switch on your mic so we can see you. Juno, can you hear me? Okay, all right, there we go.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'm having a bit of lag, so like I'd assume like it's the last question I posted.
Ask whichever you want.
Yeah, so like as I said, Mirehmet pointed out this very important thing that people with relatives in China, like not only Uyghurs, but like also, you know, some, you know, like some Chinese, like Chinese rooted, you know, students, activists, you know, lawyers, and these type of people with relatives in China. Like often these people are the ones who know the Chinese situation best. But because they have relatives in China, these are the exact people who like are incapable of speaking out because their family might be under threat. So like this is kind of a question for everyone, that like how are we supposed to deal with this?
Can I say something about this? Yeah, it is a really good question. When Chinese government started oppressing Uyghurs, yeah, this is not something new at all. As Benedict says, this has been going on for many years. The genocide against Uyghurs is happening at least several times a year. The last one, as far as I know, is in Yakan, a town near Kashgar. It's like a bigger than village, smaller than the city, and mainly Uyghurs populated region. In 2014, if I'm not mistaken, 2015, 14, yeah. And then we Uyghurs heard that there was a massacre, that a lot of Uyghur, especially men, young boys, even children were killed. And then I as an Uyghur, I kept my silence for the safety of my parents. And then in 2017, it came to my family. If we Uyghurs have all spoken up at that time, in 2014 and 15, when it happened in Yakan, then we could have probably drawn more attention from the international community, and that could have stopped the Chinese government. That maybe could have stopped the Chinese government from committing this genocide again in 2017. This trick of the Chinese government, like taking hostage parents or punishing the family members, is working really well. And Chinese government is at the moment, they have no mercy. They believe, they are not afraid of, or they are pretending, or they're acting like they don't care with the international community. That's why they keep going on with this genocide. So I don't know if even if we spoke up at that time, if it could have helped or prevented from happening. About the Chinese students or abroad speaking up, it would help, but the Chinese government is winning by threatening their family members. It's true. Yeah, that's what I can say at the moment. Sorry.
Thank you. Ben, do you have something quick to add?
Or just very quickly, I'm very aware of what a challenge this is, and I've had, just anecdotally speaking in universities, I've had a few occasions where in the formal Q&A, and so I want to thank you, Juno, for asking the question, because I've had a number of occasions where in the formal Q&A, Chinese students have asked me questions that were clearly questions that were sympathetic to the Chinese government, which is fine, and I answer those questions. But then I've had on several occasions individual Chinese students approach me privately at the end of the event to thank me for what I've said, to say that they agree with what I've said, but they say to me, we cannot say this in an open forum, even here in the UK, because we're under such monitoring from the Chinese regime. I don't know if that's the story in Bristol, but certainly that's the case in other universities. I think the only thing I would say in addition to that very quickly is, if Chinese students can find ways, even just privately, as those individuals that I mentioned did with me, to indicate what they're really thinking, I think that's helpful, because there can be a wrong perception out there that Chinese students are all pro-CCP, and I know that's not the case, but that perception can be there. So if you can find safe ways to express yourselves privately, I'd encourage you to do so, but obviously you have to weigh up the risks, and I understand those risks. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Can I add one more thing?
Very, very briefly, because we have a lot of questions we want to go through.
Okay. Another thing for the Chinese students abroad, what they can do without prevailing their names is they can also, there are a lot of projects on GoFundMe or Change. They can donate without their names, without giving their names. They can donate to those projects to support Uyghurs, Tibetans, and Hong Kongers, etc. And that's also financially, that's also very important. For example, recently, one concentration camp survivor, Tursunay, she came to America from Kazakhstan because she was not even safe in Kazakhstan. She came to US. She just arrived about 1 or 2 weeks ago, and she was tortured and in the camp, and she needs treatment, medical treatment. She needs to start her life. At the moment, I just checked, there were like $9,500 are donated, but they need to reach $50,000. So Chinese students also, by donating, they can also help.
Thank you. The next question is anonymous, so I'll read it out. I think it is addressed towards Ben Rogers. Do you think the CCP is or will attempt to suppress free speech about topics such as Xinjiang in global academia through harassment, funding, students, etc.?
The short answer is yes, and I think it's already doing so. I know many anecdotal examples of that happening. Even I myself, in a very small way, have actually received a series of anonymous kind of threatening letters more because of the work I do on Hong Kong than Xinjiang, but letters that have been sent to my own private home, which is obviously not something I readily advertise. Some of my neighbours in the street where I live have had letters, and even my mother has had letters telling her to tell me to stop doing what I'm doing. And thankfully, my mother's very relaxed, and she sort of takes the view that she gave up trying to tell me what to do many years ago. So for me, it's made no difference. But I mean, if they're prepared to do that kind of thing with me, then I would imagine the extent of it in more formal settings like academia is something to be very concerned about. And I think in particular the Confucius Institutes is something to really watch. And I know time is short, so I won't go into detail on that, but the influence of Confucius Institutes and of other Chinese government bodies in our own academic settings is a concern.
Actually, because we did have another question specifically mentioning the Confucius Institute, so if you do want to go into that shortly, that's okay.
Sure. Well, essentially, the Confucius Institutes are presented as a cultural organization teaching Chinese language and culture. And if that's what they really were, then of course, no problem with that. But the reality is, I mean, even in the words of very senior Chinese Communist Party officials who the quotes have been published, they themselves have actually said Confucius Institutes are a propaganda arm of the Chinese Communist Party, and they're embedded in universities and even schools around the world. And the effect of them is that if you go to a Confucius Institute and you raise, for example, I mean, probably Uyghurs now are added to this, but it used to be what they call the 3 Ts of Tiananmen, Tibet, and Taiwan. The conversation is shut down immediately. They use material that is promoting the Chinese Communist Party's propaganda, and et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I could go into more detail, but that's a sort of overview of the Confucius Institutes. And I've been calling on the British government to really review their status and either disband them or at least put in certain procedures and requirements that so that our own academic freedom in this country isn't undermined.
Thank you. Next, we have a question from Harry. Again, Harry, you've submitted several questions. Please ask one of them.
Hello. The question I'd like to ask, Ben, is actually about the Pope, because you did say, excuse me, that you could elaborate a bit more on that. So why isn't, in your opinion, why isn't the Pope being outspokenly critical of the Chinese communist regime at the moment?
Well, thank you. This is an issue I've written quite a lot about, and I am a Catholic, and I became a Catholic 7 years ago. I didn't come into the Catholic Church to take on the Pope, but I seem to have ended up doing that. And basically, the answer to your question is, I mean, I think it's tragic because he is a Pope that pretty much every Sunday speaks out on an issue of injustice in the world of one form or another. And the only part of the world that he has said nothing about at all, not even to express a prayer for, is China. And it said nothing on the Uyghurs, nothing on persecuted Christians in China, nothing on Tibet or Hong Kong. He's consistently refused to meet the Dalai Lama as well, in contrast to, I think, most previous popes. And I think there are 2 reasons. Well, I think the overriding reason is that he has made it a priority, and those around him have made it a priority, for the Vatican to, in inverted commas, normalize the relationship with China. I'm sure their intentions behind that are good intentions, in that I think they want to better protect the Catholic population and hopefully more broadly religious freedom as a whole in China. But the reality is they signed a deal with the Chinese government 2 years ago. It's absolutely led to no improvement. In fact, the situation's worsened for Catholics themselves, as well as, of course, everybody else. And I've been urging the Vatican to not renew this deal because it's led to nothing but no benefit, and it's actually undermined the Pope's moral authority by his silence. But it does look like they are going to renew the deal. And the other thing I think that's motivating this particular Pope is a sort of rather romantic admiration for a historical figure. I won't bore you with all the detail, but Matteo Ricci, who was an Italian Jesuit who went to China in the 16th century and managed to become influential in the Chinese imperial court. And I think somehow the current Vatican thinks they can influence the Chinese Communist Party in the same way. And I think that's somewhat delusional, but that's probably those are the two reasons why they pursued the policy. And I think, given what we know now about the scale of the human rights crisis in China, I just find his silence really shocking now.
Next, we have a question from James Keane. James, if you're comfortable to switch on your camera.
Unfortunately, I don't have a camera, but I can switch on my microphone.
Perfect.
Hi. Yes, Ben, the question is about why do you think that the CCP is undertaking this kind of crackdown across China, and particularly in places like Xinjiang and Hong Kong, but especially with regards to personal freedoms and personal intellectual liberty in Hong Kong? Do you think this is due to them becoming more confident in exerting their worldview, or do you think they're operating on the calculus that any kind of regional instability represents something, a greater instability to the country as a whole, and particularly in regards to, say, the threats to invade Taiwan? Do you think that this all what do you think this all points to?
Yeah, I think it's probably a combination of those factors, and also it does seem that Xi Jinping and the current set of leadership around him, not just him by himself, but his sort of faction, is a lot more ideological than some of his immediate past predecessors. I mean, of course, the Chinese Communist Party has always been repressive, but from the mid-90s through to the time of Xi Jinping, there was actually a degree of space. I remember going to meet human rights lawyers and civil society activists and bloggers in China who had a certain degree of space. Of course, there were red lines and restrictions, and of course people were rounded up and imprisoned, but there was that space. Similarly, the one country, two systems principle for Hong Kong was by and large abided by up until these last few years. And it does seem that Xi Jinping and his faction have intensified things to a whole new level. And I think that appears to be for ideological reasons, in terms of just wanting to stamp out all forms of dissent, of diversity, and have total control, and then export that model with their increasing aggression beyond their borders as well.
Thank you.
There's another question from Juno that lots of people upvoted. So Juno, do you want to ask your other question, which I think was your first question? We'll give you a moment. There you go.
Yeah. So as I said, like with these, like the close-knit connection between the Beijing government and the people of China, like especially in terms of ideology, because indoctrination through social media like Weibo and things, that now like Chinese people like at our age, like as me at my age, they genuinely believe in endorse Chinese communism. So, and also like with the aspect of industry, jobs and stuff, if we're boycotting, production in China, like like mostly these two aspects. How do we achieve pressuring China, like pressuring the Chinese government, but not pressuring the Chinese people? Yeah.
Thank you. That's a great question and a really important question. And I am concerned that sometimes the debate has sort of morphed between being anti-CCP and anti-China. And that's why I said at the beginning of my presentation that I'm very pro-China as a people and a country, but very anti the CCP. So I think in terms of what we do, I think firstly, in terms of sanctions, the sanctions should be as targeted as possible. So we should have sanctions, Magnitsky sanctions, which are the new legislation that's come in that enables the government to apply sanctions on individual officials. So that includes travel bans and freezing any overseas assets, and making it targeted at individuals in the government who are responsible for serious human rights violations. There's also a case for some targeted sanctions against key enterprises that are really CCP enterprises, and also for diversifying our supply chain. But as far as possible, and I know this is not easy to do, but as far as possible, we should not be sanctioning businesses that are doing business with private enterprise in China that is not controlled by the CCP. I guess the challenge is identifying what is CCP affiliated and controlled and what isn't. But as far as possible, we should be making that distinction. Similarly, I mean, I think with regard to, I know there's increasing attention on the question of Chinese students coming to the UK, and I'm delighted that that you're here and that that you're engaging in this kind of discussion. Somehow we need to find a way of giving Chinese students the opportunity to engage in an open society and a kind of liberal education, but at the same time having systems in place that prevent the CCP from encroaching even on our own academic freedom. And there probably isn't enough time to go into more depth on that. But I think it's a question of finding that balance and trying to send the signal that actually the reason we are concerned about the CCP's behavior is because we want China as a country and Chinese people to have the kind of freedoms that we enjoy and to have a better future.
This is an anonymous question immediately leading on to that. So maybe this will prompt you to say more on this. So the question is, given how many Chinese citizens study in Western universities, do you see a role for university students to discuss political topics with our Chinese peers?
Yes, I do. And I think we should never be cowed by the increasing examples of intimidation that I'm aware of. I don't know if anything has happened in Bristol or not, but I'm aware of other universities where Chinese students who are directly influenced and controlled by the Chinese embassy are not only controlled sort of ideologically, but actually sometimes mobilized to intimidate, for example, Hong Kong students. And I know from some cases that that's spilt over into intimidating British and other students who raise political issues. So I don't think we should be cowed by that. I think we should find ways to engage them, to challenge their thinking, and to share alternative perspectives. Because actually, if they hear it and through constructive but critical discussion, there's a chance that their kind of mindsets may change and may open up. But if all they see is what they read on Weibo and they're never challenged, then they're going to continue believing what the CCP tells them.
This is another question that was submitted by two people. It's a question about Muslim countries and what they have said about this issue. So have Muslim countries been calling this out? And if not, why have they not called out this issue? And also maybe to add to that. Even in our country, you mentioned Majid Nawaz, who who went on a hunger strike, but even he is often seen as quite an outsider of the Muslim community. Often he's accused by Muslims of supporting Islamophobia. So why does it take a Muslim like him to speak out, and why is there general silence from other Muslim countries?
That's another very good question. So I'm really shocked in terms of the governments of Muslim countries. If I take that part first, I'm truly shocked that whereas on the Rohingya genocide in Myanmar, which I've also worked on, there was justifiably quite an outcry from the Muslim world. It's shocking that I actually don't think I can point to any government of a Muslim majority nation that has spoken out, and there are several governments that have actually quite vocally taken the CCP's side. Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and others have, on their officials' visits to China, have really defended the Chinese government's policy. So that's really shocking. I think the short answer to that is that it's short-term economic interests and putting those above any respect for human rights, even for their own fellow Muslims. In terms of Muslim communities more generally, I mean there are an increasing number of Islamic religious leaders who are speaking out. There were quite a number on this letter that I mentioned by faith leaders. But it's true that, I mean, Majid has really led the way. And I don't quite know why others haven't followed. I don't know whether they, because it's him leading it, whether they have taken a position that is totally wrong and unjustifiable. But that could be a factor. But having said that, I mean, there are a growing number of Muslim religious leaders and community leaders who are across the spectrum of Islamic kind of theology, and who wouldn't necessarily be with Majid on other issues, who have spoken out. So I'm less worried about that. I'm more worried about the governments of the Muslim world. And just as I would say the Vatican has sold out Catholics in China, the Muslim world has sold out the Uyghurs.
This is the final question, and I'll pose it to both Ben and to Mirehmet, and you can answer this question and also give your final thoughts. What can we, and this is a question actually that, Ben, you've addressed in your talk, but I think it's a good question to sum up the talk with. What can we, and perhaps more importantly, our governments, do to try and stop China from carrying out these atrocities when it is such a dominant superpower? And maybe I'll ask Mirehmet to answer this first, and then I'll let Ben give concluding remarks.
What can we do individually, or is that the question? Or?
The question is both as individuals and our governments.
As individual, stop buying made in China, because if you spend 10 euros, that means you are giving China 10 euros power. China is using, China is a weak country. It's only powerful when it comes to the money. They have the financial means to seduce, to intimidate, to threaten others. When 30 years ago there wasn't such a thing like Chinese millionaire, but now billionaires. We're talking about Chinese billionaires around the world. So at that time, China couldn't threaten anyone in 1980s. 70s, 80s. So as individual, the first step is stop buying made in China, and raise awareness through social media especially on the Uyghur genocide, because especially on the Uyghur genocide, and then as governments. Western government think they are too dependent on China. They keep talking about that, but actually China is very dependent on European economy, European money. If Western money, if they stop buying from China, they product outside China, then China won't have that much money to buy those countries, mostly Islamic countries, as we said, they won't have that much money to buy them, to side them. And those Islamic countries are supporting China not because they love China, because they love the money of the China, the investment of China. Yeah, even the word salam alaikum is forbidden, the Arabic word, and whole Middle East Islamic countries supporting China against Uyghurs. Even the salam alaikum, there's some Islamic names are even forbidden. Their religion is forbidden. Their religion is being humiliated in China, but they are supporting China for money at the end. So the governments, Western governments, America, they shouldn't be afraid of China. They shouldn't be afraid. They shouldn't think that, oh, we are too dependent on China. They should think China is very dependent on them. They can, they start producing outside of China, and then instead of talking to them behind the screen, just talk to them directly. Stop the genocide. You are killing them. We know that. That is genocide. Stop it. And directly, then that will work. It won't work like, okay, we will talk to them under the table, behind the doors. It won't work. They've tried it too many times, and China knows how to get away with that. So as the individual, no made in China, no, stop buying made in China. And then promote raise awareness through social media, like what you guys doing are really important, I think. And also as governments, directly tell China, stop genocide. Otherwise, we don't trade with you. We don't need your market. We will build up our own market, like what Trump is. I'm sorry, but what Trump is doing is exactly what I really want to do. I hope he does more. Yeah, I'm sorry to say that, but that's what Trump is doing is almost perfect for my liking. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, just a few. I mean, I agree with everything that's just been said, and I think that I've been saying for some years, one of the things we should start by doing is to stop kowtowing to the Chinese regime. Stop, exactly as Mirehmet has said, stop believing that we need China and China's business. Although I still would try to make a distinction between the CCP and the Chinese people and China. But nevertheless, stop kowtowing. Stop. And this applies to governments, but it applies also to academic institutions, cultural institutions, businesses, everybody. I think it's a myth that we need the Chinese regime, and I think other things we should do. One is for countries, for like-minded countries across the free world, to unite and stand together much more strongly, because I think if we take different approaches, the Chinese regime can pick us off sort of one by one more easily. But if we actually stand together and have a coalition of democracies to coordinate a response to all these issues in China, that will have some effect. And one last thing, I mean, there are many other things I could say, but I know we're out of time. But one last thing that I think would be really worth thinking about is looking at ways that we could scale and penetrate the great firewall of China, the internet censorship. And I'm no tech expert by any means, so I have no idea how this would be done. But I think more investment should go into looking at how it can be done, because if we can communicate directly with people in China, and if people in China have access to a whole range of unfiltered information rather than Chinese CCP propaganda, then I think that will begin to sow the seeds of internal change as well as external pressure.
Thank you. In a moment, I'm going to pass on to Harry, who is going to tell us about the upcoming events. But first, please join me in thanking both Benedict Rogers and Mirehmet for a very informative evening.
Thank you.
Over to you, Harry.
Yeah, so I'd like to join Izzy in thanking Ben and Mirehmet for coming along. That was absolutely fantastic. But I also want to extend that thank you to everyone else who has come along. We've got people in the UK, we've got people in the Netherlands, and we've even got some people in Taiwan today. So we've got people from all over the world tuning into this live Bristol Free Speech Society event. So thank you everyone for coming, really. So yes, the next event that we've got coming up is we are co-hosting an event with the International Affairs Society about the US election, and that is on the 22nd of October. We'll essentially have a chat about the US election, what we think could happen, and have this as our usual pub discussion format. And we will leave the Zoom room open so that if there is a physical debate or some kind of debate between Biden and Trump, we will be able to watch it, discuss, and sort of have a nice, interesting time while we watch that, if it's even on. But if not, we'll have the social anyway. Secondly, there is an event coming up on the 26th of October on the Monday, where we will be hosting contemporary performance artist Franco B. Franco and I will have a discussion over Zoom, a sort of in conversation with, where we will talk about how his sort of groundbreaking art, the relationship between that and free speech issues and censorship and freedom of expression. It's a really exciting event, and I hope to see some people there if you're interested. Please, if you haven't already and you are a student, buy membership. This is for people watching, not just live, but in the future as well. If you buy membership, you could come to all of our events for free. And rather than just simply having, ticket fees and a membership fee, we have one sort of fee just for the membership, which means that to buy a ticket, which encourages more people to become members of the society and get involved.